Hello and welcome to the Spiked podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and back with me as ever this week we have Spike's editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And making his Spike podcast debut, it's regular Spike contributor Ralph Schoellhammer.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
Thanks for coming on. Coming up on today's show, we'll be discussing the barbarism in Israel, the pointlessness of Keir Starmer, and why net zero is so much more dangerous than climate change. So on Saturday, the world bore witness to some truly atrocious events. At the current count, when we're recording this, it seems as if over 1,300 people will have died in Israel following Hamas's incursion into that territory. Tom, it seems as if the more we learn, as the week has developed, the grimmer the details have got. Do you want to paint a little bit of a picture of some of the things we've learned?
Well, where to begin? I mean, as you say, at the moment of recording so far, I think it's 1,300 or in that region have been confirmed dead in Israel. We've all seen the story. So 260 people gunned down at that dance music festival in the south of the country. You had some kibbutzes, Be'eri was one, where 1 in 10 of the entire population was slaughtered. I mean, that's the literal definition of decimation that's taken place there. There's obviously been also the horrific scenes that we've seen as soldiers have been clearing the bodies from the from another kibbutz, in which there have been claims of the indiscriminate killing not only of civilians and adults but of children as well. Babies even has been mentioned, although there's a very bizarre discussion going on about that on the internet at the moment we might touch on. The scale of the depravity is unprecedented, certainly for Israel. I mean, this is important that we understand this in the context of this is the world's oldest hatred making a depraved and, in the worst possible way, spectacular return to the kind of international scene. I mean, this is not a liberation struggle. Hamas is a genocidal cult, effectively, who have proven this week that they were really about what they've said they have been about ever, since day one, that this wasn't a national liberation struggle. This was about the desire to wipe Israel and Jews, frankly, off of the map. And I can't be the only one who's kind of gone through two waves of this or experienced this in kind of two different dimensions, one of which is the shock and disgust at the violence and the barbarism and the butchery which has been perpetrated here. And then the shock and disgust at the response that we've seen across various different Western nations. You've had people take to the streets to celebrate this. Let's not mince words about this. That's what some of those demonstrations have been. You've had people on the left who have been, at best, making excuses. In other situations, and the quotes are all out there, everyone can go and read them, celebrating what went on, saying it was a day for celebration in the name of one Novara Media contributor. And I'm shocked but not surprised, I suppose, by all of that. I mean, there has been this tendency apart various different sections of politics to either harbour these prejudices or certainly to make excuses for them. But to see that trotted out in the wake of what's happened surprised even me in that sense. And I think it just shows that not only is there the immediate pressing questions about what's going to happen in Israel and in Palestine, what's going to happen on the ground, but there's also the sort of broader questions of how do we get to a point where something like this could take place, and there's a not insignificant minority of people, even in Western nations, who think to themselves, good, or what do you expect? But that's where we've ended up.
Ralph, do you think there's maybe a bit of an ignorance about Hamas in particular and what they stand for? Because a lot of people, as Tom was suggesting, seem to confuse this with a movement for Palestinian self-determination, something that might, something like that might sound progressive, but clearly this is not what is going on.
I think that's absolutely true. And I mean, if we listen to what comes out of the Hamas leadership in Qatar, I mean, if you listen closely, they always talk about the Jews, right? Not the Israelis. So for them, this is a global struggle against the Jews. And the other thing is, and this is a little bit, if one wants to push some blame on the West and others, is Hamas has been in charge of the Gaza Strip since 2007. And basically what they've done there, they have kind of conducted one of the largest brainwashing operations ever done. The median age in Gaza is 18 years old. They have a huge male surplus in the lower age group, in the lower age half of the population. And this means there's also a huge testosterone overshooting. And the idea that these 18-year-olds are kind of deeply grieved by the loss of land in 1948. I mean, this is simply not true, right? They created, exactly as you just said, right? They created a cult. Was not, as some always tend to say, the world's largest open-air prison. It was a garrison, right? All they did, right, they built kibbutzes, right, at kind of, in fake kibbutzes to prepare for the attack. So everything they did was aimed at one day to attack Israel in kind of whatever way, shape, or form. And everything they got, every money they got from Qatar, from Turkey, from the EU, from the West, that all was invested into this. Like you hear all over the news, Israel is cutting electricity, Israel is cutting water. Yes, that's true. But the reason why they don't have it on their own is because Hamas never used that money to build infrastructure. And I think this is such a frustrating thing, because what we have done in the West, the left, I think more than others, we have always romanticized these movements. I think that the Palestinian resistance, for whatever reason, particularly since the 1970s, was kind of, Rousseau's noble savage in its purest form. Right? Whatever they did was somehow understandable, whether it was the Olympic Games in Munich, whether what we saw now, somehow this was always justified. And I think what Tom said was right, because it coincided a little bit with the West's oldest hatred, right? The hatred against the Jews. But I think there's something more insidious in place as well. A lot of the modern left is, in the end, I would argue, infused with an anti-Western ideology. And in many ways, and I think the Israelis know this themselves, Israel is a Western state in the Arab world. So, and I think that is something that rubs many people the wrong way, because they did show what could be done in that area, right? They built out of nothing one of the world's most technologically advanced nations. And everybody else in the region could have done it as well, but they didn't. Like the only other Arab nations that are successful are those that have quote unquote oil coming out of the ground. And I think there is something going on there as well. There is the kind of self-hatred that we'll see among the left in the West is also projected onto Israel. I think that's at least some part of the story.
We should definitely come on to that sort of question of, Israelophobia, some people have called it, Israel almost cast as, the little Satan to America's big Satan. Tom, I mean, one factor in, obviously for a very long time, support for Palestine has been almost a kind of sine qua non of the West. But something has changed a little bit in terms of the development of identity politics that has fueled something that is outright, I think, explicitly anti-Semitic.
Oh, 100%. I think what we've seen demonstrated here is that we've got this sort of toxic mix of sort of Islamist anti-Semitism, sort of left identitarian anti-Semitism, and the upshot of it, when you put it all together and you bring it to boil, is the kind of barbarism that we haven't seen since the Second World War, effectively. If you talk about the indiscriminate killing of civilians because of who they are, because of the fact that they are Jews, let's not mince words about that. That's what's been going on here. And it's fascinating, because I think and it's something that we've been writing about for a very long time, but I think Frank Frady really put his finger on it in his long reefer spike this week, where he talks about the thing about having a hierarchy of victimhood, which is obviously what has been maintained in Western progressive circles for some time now. First of all, it's quite unseemly. Do you want to enter a kind of competition for who's got the most victim points, and therefore you're deserving of sympathy, support, resources, or whatever? It's unpleasant. It pits people against each other. There's another undertone to it, which is it can also create a level of jealousy, almost. I mean, that's one thing that's happened because of the experience of the Holocaust, because of centuries, millennia of oppression and pogroms and so on. That irritates a certain kind of woke identitarian. It irks them. And so you've seen this very conscious attempt to kind of delegitimize the status of Jews, to talk about them as kind of hyper white and privileged and so on, even in the face of the kind of scenes that we've been seeing, and bringing it back to the kind of domestic context, I suppose, and some of the backlash that we've already seen on the streets, not just quote-unquote pro-Palestine demonstrations, which have just lapsed into open anti-Semitism and support for Hamas, but also a kind of natural rise in people being assaulted, shouted at, spat at, and so on. We live in a society which constantly wants to talk about and reckon with racism past and present, to a point which has become almost slightly trivial and excessive, whether or not some woman a black British woman at the palace with the royals gets asked an awkward question. That's the sort of discussion that we're having. And yet, put the Hamas thing to one side for a moment. Even the anti-Semitism which is experienced by British Jews is never really properly reckoned with. They're 0.5% of the population. They're the victims of about a quarter of all of the religiously motivated hate crimes. Things happen and never really get discussed in any serious way. I mean, that shocking scenes a couple of years ago where there was that group of men who were driving around northwest London, Jewish areas of northwest London, saying, kill the Jews, fuck their mothers, rape their daughters, was something that we talked about for a week and then it went away. And I think it's another reminder that what is, in terms of so much the discussion about Israel, the rage against Israel, the reason that it has permeated for so long is because it has become the language through which anti-Semitism is expressed in its most vicious form, and yet it's still made excuses for it. It's not really talked about. It's fascinating.
And the kind of thought police that we rail against constantly on this podcast, the people who want to cancel everyone, the literal police, who arrest people for saying women can't have penises, are always oddly silent around this kind of time. Nothing. There was no action taken against that convoy of people saying we're going to rape your mothers and daughters, but see what happens if you say something far milder. And again, it's not just the outright sort of anti-Semitism that you see; it's the kind of indifference to it from the political elites, from the cultural elites. There's been an interesting episode in sort of how does football deal with this? After the horrific murder of George Floyd, everyone recognises that was a tragedy, but in America, England players been taking the knee for several years. Now the FA says it's going to ban Israel flags from football matches and will not light up Wembley Stadium in the Israel colours because it might prove too divisive. So there is clearly, a hierarchy of racism, a hierarchy of victimhood. One person in America versus 1,300 Jews in Israel. It's staggering when you sort of put those things two together. Ralph?
I mean, I think we have in the West is this weird combination of a minority complex and the level of arrogance. And just to put an example to this, what you just mentioned, we saw kind of all over Western cities in the last couple of weeks, right? People with Palestinian flags in Sydney, where they literally yelled Jews to the gas. In Germany, where people yelled Hamas, Hamas, Jews to the gas. So this happens, and kind of nobody does something against it. Really, like the police stands there and looks at it. If these would be neo-Nazis, all of them, as they should, right? Yeah. Would probably be arrested, or at least the demonstration would be dissolved. But there's this weird combination, like it's the arrogance on the one hand that we pretend that, well, this is just what these people do, right? There's this famous saying, it's a bigotry or a racism one of low expectations, which is, the Germans like pretzels and beer, and the Japanese open sushi places, and if you have a Muslim minority, they just go out on the streets and chant Jews into the gas. It's just, it's just part of the colorful mosaic of multiculturalism. And then there is the kind of minority complex that when these things tend to go out of hand, you can't really do anything against it, because it turns out that these people very often mean it. Right? I think one of the things is that very often, and we saw this, and Spike has played a significant role in this, if you push back against wokeness, they tend to go back fairly quickly. They go to the things fairly quickly. But there are other groups who are significantly more motivated. And a lot of this, you mentioned, I think, quite nicely also what happened with BLM, who also, at least the US branch, has behaved atrociously in the last couple of days. But there's the same thing. This is, you take a knee, but if we are completely honest, it never had anything to do with Black lives. It was, look at me, right? This arrogance. Look at me, how virtuous I am. I'm British, but I take a knee against police brutality in the United States. We had also had the same demonstrations in Vienna. Vienna has, I don't know, maybe 2,000 Black people, and none of them is from the United States. So, and most people who demonstrated have never been to the United States. But it was, look at me, I'm standing up for the right thing.
And we should specify that, Black Lives Matter chapter literally posted, a picture, essentially of a person in a hang glider, recalling the scenes of those 260 people murdered at a music festival, saying, I stand with Palestine, saying that they support this openly. I
mean, that's been one of the things that's been so stomach-turning about it, is we're used to apologism in the face of anti-Semitism or Islamist terrorism in general. We suddenly get into some bizarre kind of root causes discussion about why someone has just gone and indiscriminately murdered people. At that point, if you find yourself reaching for the context at a moment in which the bodies are barely cold, then there is something fundamentally wrong with you. I think Ralph's exactly right, is that this profound racism in this discussion stems from this idea. It was like, well, what do you expect? I mean, it's essentially suggesting that the people who committed these awful crimes are basically like animals, that you can't, they are what else are they going to do? This is essentially like pogroms are the voice of the unheard, is basically what they're trying to say at this point. And on the one hand, the kind of identitarian takes on this atrocity have, on the one hand, made you realise how trivial some of these people are, some of these kind of woke commentators and so on. It gets started and there are some eyewitness accounts of rapes, and they say, oh, that's just racist. And you think, really, it's racist to accuse a terrorist of rape at this point. And that's kind of what we're getting into. This discussion, which we've already gestured to, which is broken out now, about whether or not babies were just killed or also beheaded, which is broken out now, is an absolutely absurd kind of discussion that we've found ourselves in. So on the one hand, you think these people are so gripping to their narratives, they so want Hamas, if not to be the good guy, then at least to be the kind of villain that you can understand. But it's gotten so much worse than that. There was, as we've been talking about, open celebration of this, talk about this as a blow against the colonists, talking about this as if it was one step towards a more just and righteous world. We've moved into a completely different stage of this now. And I think it's not just a case of Islamist extremists doing one thing and woke leftists making excuses for it. Then they're now a lot closer than they were previously, even in the wake of the horrors that we've just witnessed.
I think it's a great point, and just as a quick add on to this, because let's talk about root causes, right? I think we can have this conversation. And if you take a look, the world is never a just place. So I think every community, every country, every wannabe state must deal with the cards that they have been dealt. But we never hear these conversations, for example, in Southeast Asia. Right? These countries, many of them were also colonies, right? But they decided after colonialism was over, after they decolonized, to say, okay, we need to get our act together and then do something, build something. That if you ever have been, I have been myself, if you ever have been to Gaza, that's prime real estate on the Mediterranean. So hypothetically, in 2007, Hamas could have taken over and say, you know what? We put a pin in the whole Islamism, death to the Jews thing for 10 years and built 5-star hotels and turned this into Côte d'Azur and the Eastern Mediterranean. Everybody from Israel to Qatar to the EU, they would have given them more money than they could count, because if they said, if we can pacify this is the biggest success we can have. But they didn't want that. And I think this is also something we in the West have to understand. There are groups of people who have different priorities. And the weird thing is, and this goes to what you said, because this is a form of racism, many talk for them, but they never listen to what they actually say. I mean, just in recent days, they come out and say, you love life and we love death. I mean, and we have these, for example, when the Israeli military called them up and said, empty this building, we're going to bomb it. And they say, we won't do it. And I said, you have to. There are children there. And they say, well, if these children have to die for the greater cause, then they have to die. These people think differently. These are people who are in stores and shops who have literally, right, the martyr of the month on the wall, right? Where women are honored if 2 out of their 3 children became suicide bombers. So the idea that this is just like Switzerland, they just took a slightly different turn at one point, it's just not true. And we talk about them, and this is just like the Black Lives Matter thing, we talk about them without ever really looking at what's going on in those societies.
And Tom, finally, just to finish off, I mean, the thing that perplexes me is that the way that people can claim to be on the side of the Palestinians while also seemingly backing Hamas, because Hamas is not interested in the welfare of the Palestinians, as Ralph has alluded to. It's not interested in Palestinian self-determination. How did we get into that muddle? And why why are people accused, if you sort of speak up for Israel, if you speak up for the people who've been murdered, you're accused of hating the Palestinians, when the opposite is the truth?
I think the reason we got into that muddle is because of the fact that it's a mix of ignorance, and it's never really for them been about the Palestinians in the first place. If you're really that concerned about the Palestinians, why is there not even a moment for them to say, isn't it an absolute tragedy that the Palestinian cause is now effectively led by this genocidal terrorist group, that it has completely obliterated any aspirations that there once were for self-determination, consuming it within this cult, genocidal,
and suicidal.
This genocidal and suicidal attempt to basically just wipe Israel and Jews off the map. Why not even dwell for a moment on the points that we all know is true, which is that this organisation, which is reigning over Gaza, has since its founding been committed to the murder of Jewish people, that sees itself locked in a kind of apocalyptic struggle, effectively, that this is something which anyone who pays even the least bit of attention to it surely shouldn't support. But I think it's quite clear that certainly for your kind of average Western woke leftist, they have no idea about any of this stuff, or they choose to ignore it when they do know about it, because for them it's just part of a really crude, really simplistic sort of battle between evil Western states, which are colonialist even when they're not colonialist, which are drenched in racism even when they're certainly not the kind of societies that they think they are. And the Palestinians are just a pawn in that game for them. I think that's what's become abundantly clear in the midst of all of this. So if we are going to have a conversation about the welfare of the Palestinians, why don't we talk about the fact that they have, in such tragic circumstances, come to be led by these complete maniacs who are, if anything, in everything that they do, put those people in more harm.
Hi, it's Fraser here. I just wanted to let you know about a very special event we've got coming up. Spiked will be returning to the Battle of Ideas, Britain's premier ideas festival where free speech truly reigns. While we're there, Spiked will be recording a very special live edition of this podcast. That'll be on Saturday, the 28th of October at 12:15 p.m. For the pods, joining me will be Tom Slater, as per usual, plus some special guests, including Konstantin Kisin, Rakib Hassan, and Inaya Falarin Iman. Now, if you haven't got your ticket already to the Battle of Ideas, then now is the time to get one. It won't just be our podcast. We'll also be recording a special edition of Last Orders with Tom Slater, Chris Snowden, and special guests to come. Plus, across the weekend, there will be loads of Spiked writers speaking on all kinds of panels, as well as hundreds of other fascinating thinkers. To get your ticket for the Battle of Ideas, just go to battleofideas.org.uk, and while you're there, you can use the promo code SPIKED to get yourself 20% off a ticket. That's battleofideas.org.uk and the promo code SPIKED to get yourself a 20% off discount. See you at the event. So the Labour Party conference wrapped up this week. Keir Starmer set out his vision, such as it is.
Yeah.
I think an hour later, I watched the whole speech. I'm still none the wiser as to what he wants to do the country, what he believes in, what his principles are.
Yeah, there was a lot of cliches. There was a lot of very dull delivery. I can't be the only one. I struggle to actually follow what he's saying. Not because it's particularly complicated, but just because it's the delivery. It's so numbing. You know, it's like kind of drowning in blancmange when you hear him and Rachel Reeves speak, incidentally. You got the kind of usual ragbag of kind of New Labour tribute act. You know, we need to embrace the public sector, but we need to reach out to the private sector. We need a new partnership. There was some relatively interesting stuff on house building. I'm not sure if I trust him to deliver it, but nevertheless, it's nice that someone is at least talking about that. But beyond that, it's all the kind of usual, essentially just focus group platitudes. I mean, the things that were usually interesting for the wrong reasons. Like, they seem to have a desire, perhaps because they're so desperate to demonstrate their credibility and their economic credentials in the wake of the Jeremy Corbyn period, to seemingly invest more and more power in unelected bodies. So they now want to, beef up the OBR so that they can effectively veto their policies, certainly to give them, more ability to undermine anything that they might want to do if the sums don't add up. There's constant talk about empowering this body or that body to ensure that this happens. This constant talk about these ironclad fiscal rules of theirs to restrain their ability to move. I don't really know who this is supposed to inspire, apart from maybe the kind of the right of the Labour Party commentary or something like that, but they seem to spend a lot of time dwelling on these things. It's just such a reminder that there is this enthusiasm, this excitement amongst the commentators, amongst the pundit set, particularly because anti-Toryism has become such a kind of religion for these people. But that excitement is not earned by what the Labour Party is actually putting out there, and it's certainly not reflected in the polls. The clear picture that you've got is that Labour do have this commanding lead, which is built almost entirely on how much the Tory party have fucked it last time around. There is the lead that they have, certainly amongst working class voters, is so much smaller than it is in the rest of the country. That what is supposed to be the Labour Party's base are not convinced by Keir Starmer. The biggest chunk of them, the most significant chunk of them, are undecided who they're going to vote for, and the rest of them are kind of splaying off in a couple of different directions. The lead is very soft, and yes, he's gifted with quite terrible opponents at this point. But it's such a fascinating gap between the kind of excitement that Labour getting back into power seems to provoke amongst commentary just on the basis of sheer loyalty, but the sheer lack of substance that he's actually articulating when he gets up on a podium.
Yeah, definitely. And Ralph, one thing that always disappoints me about the current moment is that in Britain we lived through this kind of populist moment of Brexit, and it feels like on both sides in terms of Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. Although Keir Starmer is slightly worse, is that we have basically technocracy coming back. We have people who are offering, technocratic solutions or non-solutions to our problems, not really saying what they think, not really having any principles, just saying we'll tinker, we'll empower the state more, we'll empower the officials more, the civil servants, and let them get on with it. It just feels like it doesn't match up to the scale of the problems and challenges that we have at the moment.
No, I think that's true, and I think that you are way too polite. I think we have, and this is also a problem in continental Europe. We have moved from solving problems to managing problems, and this is, and a lot of it. What happens then is, and the managing basically consists of a government trying to push it on to the next government.
Yeah,
like we know that many of the things, many of the plans. I'm sure we're going to talk about this later. For example, in the environmental area, in the energy area, basically what comes from governments, not just in Britain, is fantasy stuff, right? A lot of this is sheer nonsense, and I think they know that, right?
Yeah.
They say, 2050, who cares about 2050? I'll be long out of office by 2050. I might even be dead by 2050. So this is, and the problem is, of course, the bills are due now, and the promise is always it's happening in the future. It reminds me, because we talked about Hamas a couple of minutes ago, but this is, and I mean, I'm being deliberately provocative here, but this is a little bit, the communists always said the same thing in the Soviet Union. The utopia is just around the corner. Give us one more year, right? And you see, in the Islamic world was the same thing, right? Like Islam will rule, the caliphate will come back. Just give us one more year. And we are now the same, right? Climate change will end and net zero will be here. And then your electricity bills will drop and you will heat your house with wind and solar. Just give us one more year. We are in an almost neo-religious phase with all kinds of weird belief systems.
And ironically, the sort of the wackier it is, the more sensible we're told these people are. The most Keir Starmer is supposed to be this sort of sensible, pragmatic, technocratic leader, and he believes some fairly wacky things, not just on the energy thing, but for instance, that 1 in 1,000 women might have a penis.
Yeah, it's 99.9%.
99.9%.
Still a hell of a lot of penises. Yeah, but. This is the thing, and this is a point that many people have made, is the fact that so much of what the commentariat talk about in terms of British politics is so detached from reality. So they talk constantly about the centre, by which they mean people who agree with me.
Yeah.
That's all it means. If you look at where the British public are on various different issues, they're often far to the left or far to the right of where your average Tory MP or Labour MP
usually further to the left on the economy, further right on sort of cultural matters.
Exactly, and yet that's not reflected in British politics, as we know. Also, some of this discussion, as you say, about being sensible, all parties really. I mean, Rishi Sunak has pushed back on the net zero agenda ever so slightly, but all of them are wedded to a policy of self-impoverishment on the back of technologies, which, as we're going to get onto, are pie in the sky in terms of delivering the energy that we need. All of them, as a matter of almost like religious fealty, have to mouth the platitudes about net zero and to try and out-compete one another about how ambitious they're going to be in pursuing this no-hoper energy policy. And as you say, even on some of the gender stuff, where Keir Starmer is on a really sticky wicket is the fact that the Conservatives have kind of really called his bluff on this issue now.
Yeah.
They've really recognised that this is something which is cut through, which people recognise is completely deranged. They look at Keir Starmer talking about 99.9% of women not having penises and think, what the hell is he going on about? And again, come back to that question of sensibleness and credibility. I think if you want to be a sensible, credible politician who wants to be elected, that maybe you should concede that women don't have penises.
Yeah.
Like, he's been willing to upset the left of his party on so many issues. He campaigned for the leadership as a Corbynite and then governed like a Blairite, as in within his own party. There's been U-turn after U-turn, fence sitting followed by fence sitting on all these kinds of different things. But when it came to the gender issue, which is clearly a problem for him, he still can't make that step to say what we all assume he actually believes, but is terrified of actually saying, which is that biological sex is real. So I think that issue, as with many others, is just a reminder that the supposed sensibles of politics are either nuts or in hock to people who are nuts. And that's definitely the picture with Keir Starmer, I think.
And the other area that the Tories haven't done enough to challenge him on, I think, is race. Labour still plans to institute a kind of race equality act to essentially describe all of the UK's problems as down to systemic racism. He plans to give government money to various companies on the basis of the race of their owner. I mean, this is plainly
worked out well so many times before when this sort of thing has been. But that's the other thing. It reminds me a bit of Joe Biden as well, because of the fact that when he was obviously during the 2020 campaign, there was this push from particularly kind of anti-woke liberals to say, I mean, there was literally a piece by Yasha Monk that said, if you hate wokeness, vote for Joe Biden, which I'm sure is probably a headline he regrets at this point, because the fact that, and quite understandably, people thought, look at Joe Biden, he's the most down the line kind of guy. The idea that he's reading, Robin DiAngelo is ridiculous. He's probably not reading anything these days. I'm not sure if anything can hold his attention. He's this old guy. He's not going to be this kind of over the top wokester, but
has a quite right wing track record.
Exactly.
Busing.
Exactly.
Segregation.
On all these different, so not without
mass incarceration.
To be generous to the anti-woke liberals, not without cause did they make this prognostication. But day one, he's signing executive orders about transgender women being able to compete in women's sports. He's signing executive orders around the racial question and equity. He was at one point trying to apportion COVID relief on the basis of race, so he got held up by the courts. I think with Keir Starmer we'll see a very similar thing, is that he is, in a slightly different way, an empty vessel, but the empty vessel has to be filled with something, and it will be filled with this nonsense, definitely. Before we get back to the last section of the show, I just want to let you all know about our very exciting upcoming online event that we're having on Tuesday the 17th of October. Brendan O'Neill is going to be doing an extra special live recording of his podcast, The Brendan O'Neill Show, and he's going to be joined by the one and only Graham Linehan, comedy writer, gender critical warrior, and very firmly cancelled at this point. They're going to be discussing Graham's new book, a kind of memoir of his cancellation, as well as all the issues around cancel culture and gender ideology as well. Most importantly, they'll be taking audience questions, so you really don't want to miss this. This event is online, it's on Zoom, and it's exclusively for Spike supporters, members of our online donor community. So if you already are a Spike supporter, thank you very much for your support. Go to the online hub now and claim your free ticket. If you're not already a Spike supporter, now is surely the best time to sign up. For as little as £5 each month, you can claim your free ticket to this event, many more events like it, as well as all kinds of other exclusive perks, including ad-free reading on Spiked, access to our comment section, and much more. So to find out more about that, just go to spiked-online.com/supporters. That's spiked-online.com/supporters.
So one of the highlights/lowlights of the Labour conference was Ed Miliband, the failed Labour leader who, badly lost the 2015 election, but he's reinvented himself as a kind of climate martyr. And one thing he's been saying, he's been banging the drum for, is he obviously wants to go faster on net zero than Rishi Sunak. He wants this kind of all clean electricity by 2030. But also he says, and you hear this a lot in green circles, that actually net zero is the answer to our energy security problems. Now, what do you make of that argument? I mean, surely renewables are not going to make our energy more secure.
Well, if you allow, I think this is a great moment to kind of tie all the conversations we had together in an attempt, at least. But a little bit this, starting with the fictional and then moving into the very real. But in many ways, all these debates remind me of H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, right? Where you kind of have the story where in the far future, humanity is divided into this basically two races, right? The Morlocks who live underground and they do all the hard work, and then you have kind of the weak, feeble Eloi on top. And this strikes me a little bit is a good metaphor of what's happening in politics, right? We expect that somebody does all the work, and this brings me then to the energy question. While we, and I say just we in a generalized way, have all these absurd debates, again, women with penises and diversity bureaucrats, and I think the NHS had a position for a lived experience officer that would have paid you £110,000 a year. So this is like, you can do this if, as long as the Morlocks work, right? The Eloi can engage in these kind of things. But what we have been trying to do in the West, and this is kind of where I think we can put this together, is we outsource it. I mean, look at Joe Biden, right? Joe Biden, again, he tries to, as a friend of mine says, he's kind of trying to ride two horses with one ass, or as your listeners would say, with one arse, I think would be the correct term. So they say, and this is now really important also to connect to the Israel thing, they basically turned a blind eye to Iran's exports of oil. They turned a blind eye to Venezuela, right? They allow these, they again, Qatar, right? Again, a Hamas supporter is a massive LNG exporter. So they allow this, but they don't extract resources at home because they have to appease the environmental lobby. And let's be very clear. We heard this after the attack on Ukraine, right? That Europe is more united than ever. NATO is more united than ever. And when Hamas shot 5,000 rockets in Israel, let's be clear, without the shale revolution in the United States, without LNG from the United States, which produced as much energy as two Saudi Arabias over the last every year over the last 10 years, there would have been no way for Europe to resist Russia's attack on Ukraine, because there would have been not little gas, there would have been no gas. The lights would have gone out. there would have been no way to have sanctions on Iran because the world would have needed that energy. So they would have had twice as much, 3 times as much money to give to Hamas. So these things are interconnected. And this bothers me a little bit in today's debates, right? We have become such a present tense culture, and we will see the same with Israel. That's what I'm worried about, right? Now everybody's up in arms on each side. But how long? 2 weeks, 3 weeks, right? And we have become so desensitized to these things. So again, we hear about killed babies, and then 2 weeks people will say, yeah, again with the babies, we have heard this. This is really, really an issue. We know, that's always my key point. And this is why we don't understand, for example, people like Hamas, is there are people in this world who really think in these historical dimensions. It's a very Western thing to be so bound to a present tense culture that we believe that pretty much everything is just a quick flag, a quick, black space in an Instagram account, and then you move on. We are not serious about anything, whereas others are. I mean, I'm not happy about what they're serious about, but they are, and we are not. And that's why we have these weird debates, like the gender debates. I would really wish, and I hope that what happened over last weekend allows us to do this, to kind of say, the woke movement has lost all moral credibility. So I want to use this. I know this is cynical, but I want to use this to say, the way you behave, I don't take you serious on anything else either. So you're gonna. There was a moment where you could have shown moral clarity, you didn't. So don't, somebody must stand up in the room and say, the whole, who has a penis, this must end. We must become a serious society and a serious country again. And I think this is, so these things are tied together. We need more engineers and less, gender study majors. We need people to understand why the light actually turns on if you flick the switch. And people don't know this, right? They just think food is in the supermarket, money in the ATM, and the electricity comes out of a socket in the wall. But there is something behind that, and we need to appreciate this again.
No, I think that's right. I mean, my problem is, and why I'm quite pessimistic about all this, is there have been so many occasions in recent years where the elites could have shaken themselves out of the bizarre orthodoxies that they've wedded themselves to. And that could be on all kinds of different fronts. That could be on the economic front, that could be on the energy front, certainly on the gender and identity politics front. You are confronted either with a problem which is so big and real and concrete, like a pandemic, or like a war in Europe, or like the indiscriminate slaughter of Jews in Israel. And you would think that this would be a point in which people would start to reassess some of the roads that they've been going down in all kinds of different ways. It never really happens. That's what's fascinating about it, because the people who are least affected by the consequences of their policies and rhetoric and words are the ones who are setting those policies. There is genuinely, and it's not just sort of populist talking point, the distance, I think, between the people who govern us and the governed is so immense now. And that's not even in terms of the lives that people lead, but also just in terms of the kind of moral universe they occupy. And one always hopes that something will right that ship, that they will come to grapple with what has gone wrong and start to be serious about the problems that we're facing, not least because the stakes are so incredibly high, literally a question of life or death in some of the issues that we're talking about. But it never actually arrives, or at least not in the medium term, it feels like.
I think that's a great point. I mean, I'm always tempted to defend the elites a little bit, which is, I mean, we have created or it has evolved, and we've become such an individualistic culture, such an individualistic society in many ways, right? Kind of where your authentic self, the way you identified yourself, is the only true criteria. Yet somehow we would expect to have an elite that kind of wants to act as a role model, right? That kind of, in a sense, I like this. I don't know if the British still like it, but like the Victorians in the 19th century, right? That you might not be born as a member of the aristocracy, but you should still strive to become a gentleman. These kind of things. So I think value-wise, I think we can still learn a lot from the 19th century. It's an unpopular thing to say, but honestly, there was a time when I think about half the prostitutes in London were under 15 years old in the 19th century, until people got out and said, this is wrong, right? This should not happen. And what they did is they abolished it, right? So that they made this disappear. Now in the 21st century, we have grooming gangs in Rotherhampton, in Yorkshire, and all these places where pretty much the same thing happened. The Victorians turned again in the 19th century, but we don't turn against it because we say, as we said previously, well, this is just in that culture, it's just different. And can you really criticize it? Can you really say anything about it? We have no moral compass anymore. And this is but this ties all together, because this is what we saw over the last couple of days, and this is, we only have fake discussions, and in the energy sector it's the same thing. there is no world like where anything works without energy. And if somebody tells you it does, they're lying to you, right? That they use it as a religion, but it has nothing to do with reality.
And rather than also like waiting around for the elites to get their act together, because they're clearly not going to do that, even if we would prefer that they would. This is another thing that's depressing about at least at the moment, the way in which the kind of populist moment seems to have, if not waned, is kind of not necessarily in the ascendancy, in Britain at least, different case in many other countries, of course, is so depressing, because I think the antidote to so much elite hysteria and nonsense is the public. Because there was that period in which people were galvanised by things like the Brexit vote. People felt like their vote mattered. They felt like they were suddenly actually a consideration in the discussion about all these sorts of things. They'd put themselves on the map. And I think on a lot of these issues that we're talking about, the reason Rishi Sunak in his very mild and meek way is trying to push back on net zero agenda ideology or whatever is because ordinary people are a factor in this discussion now in a way that they weren't previously. So I think that's all the more reason that if you think the elites have completely lost the plot, it's surely more fuel and impetus to push forward with that kind of populist revolt, which was towards kind of bringing politics back down to people's views, priorities, values. I think if we can reignite that, we'd get certainly a lot closer to being sane than we are at the moment.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.